it's a whole new world where I don't actually have any producers. So I'm going to ask you to be my producer for just a second. How do I sound?
I think you sound wonderful.
Okay. I'm not like blowing out the mic in any way?
No, you are not.
Okay. Awesome. Love to hear it. Thank you. Thank you for playing along. Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Drew. Americans have had a lot to digest politically and economically over the past couple weeks. Trump's volatile approach to tariffs began basically as soon as he took office, with Canada and Mexico being the first targets, but so-called Liberation Day marked the start of something akin to full-blown chaos. Everyone's getting tariffed big time, but actually just 10% across the board, except for China, which will get a 34% tariff. No, wait, it's a 104% tariff. Actually, 145% tariff. But then consumer electronics are exempted, but wait, maybe not. As you probably saw, the markets plunged and then rebounded some, and then plunged again, and then rebounded some again. As of the time we're recording this podcast, the S&P 500 is still down about 12% from its peak. So how are Americans digesting all of this? If you look at Trump's approval average overall, it looks like he's somewhere around net -5. But this has all been so fast moving that those numbers may already be outdated. If you look at polls from before and after Liberation Day alone, it looks like he's dropped about a whole 7 percentage points on net in just that time. And the majority of Americans have gone from tepidly supporting tariffs during the campaign last year to outright rejecting them. It's one of those times when you want as up-to-date data as possible. And lucky for us, our guest today has just that. Kristen Soltis Anderson is a longtime friend of the pod. She's the founder of Echelon Insights, which works with Republican campaigns, and she's also a contributor to the New York Times and CNN. Welcome to the podcast, Kristen.
Thank you for having me, Galen.
So at Echelon, you conduct a monthly verified voter omnibus poll, which you can describe what that is. But you just came out of the field, I believe, this morning. So your data could not be any more timely. What is the top line takeaway from this hot off the presses survey?
So you are correct. This data is fresh out of the oven. It is piping hot fresh. It is from our monthly verified voter omnibus survey, which, as you describe, it's something every month we go into the field. We talk to 1,000 voters. And what makes our survey unique, we think, is that we match our respondents back to the voter file. So this is not just 1,000 bots you find on the internet who claim to be voters. This is, we do some pretty rigorous stuff to make sure that this is reflective of real voters, real people who are verified. And we like to weight our surveys to the likely electorate. So in this case, we're still operating off of a likely electorate model from what we know from the 2024 election. As we approach the midterms, we may shift that more to like, what does a midterm electorate look like? But every month, the reason we call it an omnibus is that we ask a bunch of questions of things that are very broad, that we are really interested in. We release it all publicly. And then at the end of the survey, our clients can add questions on things that they are curious about. They get those answers. Unfortunately, I will not be sharing all of those with you all today. Now, as far as what we found in this month's survey, we have traditionally been finding Donald Trump's job approval to be fine. Not great, nothing to write home about, but generally positive-ish. This month, we find his job approval is at 47% and disapproval is at 51%. So you said before the trend you're seeing is a -5 on net. We're finding -4, but that is a slight decline from where we had him in March. And I think for me, the bigger warning sign if you're the White House is twofold. The first is that his job approval is also more intense on the disapproval side than on the approval side. I wrote a column about a week ago around the sort of emotional valence of voters, and that voters who are mad or are opposed to what Trump is doing seem to be more fired up than those who are in support. And in our poll, we find that about 3 in 10 Americans love what Donald Trump is doing. They are strongly approve, but 4 in 10 are strongly disapprove. There's a little bit more intensity on that strong disapprove than there is on the approval side. There are more that somewhat approve of Trump than somewhat disapprove. If you look at the mushy middle, it leans, more toward positivity, but overall, that intensity is really there with disapprove. The second thing that should be a potential warning sign for the White House is that Trump's job approval on the economy is a net -8. It is typically, in his first term, his job approval on the economy was better than his job approval overall. You had some slice of the electorate, not huge, but it still existed, of people who said, look, I don't like the guy. I don't like him as president, but at least he's doing a good job on the economy. That's no longer the case. In fact, you now have sort of the opposite. You have some people that may love what he's doing overall as president, but have some questions about how he's handling the economy. And it is tough to put that toothpaste back in the tube, especially if your signature economic policy is these tariffs. Approve, disapprove on the tariffs. We have that net -15. So right now, these tariffs and the reaction stemming from them is a real potential problem for Trump. And right now, you have voters that are thinking, I want this guy to lower my cost of living. And they're not, at least in our data, saying that they think he's doing it.
Yeah, you're mentioning a lot of things that I want to dig deeper on, both the emotional aspect, how voters feel, not just what they think, and then also on the tariffs in particular. But I want to stick with the omnibus while we're talking about this piping hot data. In March, it looked like the brightest spot for Trump was immigration policy. Voters approved of Trump on immigration at net +18. And even then, even back in March, things were pretty middling. He was at net -2 on the economy. He was only, net +1 overall. But people said, so there were a lot of those voters who said, I don't really like Trump. I don't really like what he's doing, but I actually think he's doing a good job on immigration. Is that still a bright spot for him? I mean, we've been focusing a lot on tariffs, but there have also been some stories about folks getting caught up in his hawkish approach to immigration who may not necessarily be the targets or the stated targets of the policies.
Yeah, so when we test in our survey, one, do you trust Republicans or Democrats more on a variety of issues? The issue where Republicans still have significantly more trust than Democrats is on immigration and border security. 52% of voters in our survey say that they trust Republicans more. Only 36% say they trust Democrats more. Similarly, when we ask just job approval on how is Trump handling immigration? That still remains positive. 54% approve, 44% disapprove. But as you noted, that's not as high as it was last month. And this is where I do think there is some big risk to the Trump White House politically in some of the way they're handling some of the things around deportations. So, for instance, you just had this press conference today with the president of El Salvador, saying, well, there was this gentleman who was deported because of an administrative error. The U.S. is now saying, well, we don't have any authority to get him back because he's in El Salvador. And now the president of El Salvador is saying, well, I don't have any authority to just send this guy to the United States. And so this is the kind of story where even an American who thinks, yes, illegal immigration is a problem. Yes, border security is a problem. Yes, we need to get tougher and crack down, can look at this story and go, well, that doesn't seem good. That's not exactly what I was going for. And by keeping the focus on something like that, by not just addressing the error, by not just solving the problem, which seems to me like it ought to be eminently solvable, you're keeping the focus on the worst components of a policy that is otherwise has a fair amount of support or at least sympathy from the American public.
Yeah, it's interesting. At the start of Trump's second term, there was some talk about a potentially enduring conservative renaissance in the culture, that wokeness had been so soundly rejected. I mean, there may be questions about how soundly it was rejected in 2024. but that especially with shifts amongst young voters and median voters, and this idea that, in fact, if everyone had voted in America, Trump would have done even better, that the low propensity voter, that the majority had moved to a more conservative position. Now, we are used to talking about thermostatic public opinion on this podcast, which is that Americans quickly tire of people who, I don't know, overinterpret their mandate and do unpopular things, and then they move in the opposite direction. But there are also trends that can last decades. Like, I think we were coming out of a decades-long trend in which America was becoming culturally more liberal. Do you think this is, speaking of market turmoil, a sort of buy the dip moment on sort of wokeism and cultural liberalism? Or do you think that even if Trump sort of does unpopular things, we have moved beyond the 2017 to 2021 era of liberalism?
So I think that the 2020, 2021 era is gone. And I think we're unlikely to go back to it, in part because you hear so many people who have come out of it saying, oh, thank goodness, we no longer have to do this. Oh my gosh, I can, like, they don't seem to be mourning that era too much. With that said, the pendulum does swing, and there will be something new, and there will be something next, and there will be something different, and there will be backlash to some of what is going on. This is why I think if you are the Trump administration, for as much as Republicans love to, kind of trigger their opponents, or whatever phrase we're going to use for it, you can put points on the board for the policies that you care about without like unnecessarily antagonizing and thus sparking this kind of a backlash. The flip side is something like immigration, where if people believe something has gotten out of control, they will swing heavily against it. And so on immigration, you now have a public that really has swung pretty significantly to the right on the issue, I think, as backlash to what they think was an overly permissive policy during the Biden administration. But that means it would not be surprising to see a backlash if all of a sudden you have more and more and more stories of people being deported to this horrible prison in El Salvador who were legally in the United States, or a court had not ordered them deported, or there is no credible real evidence of them having committed crime. Like, those are the kinds of things that I can see triggering a backlash to the backlash as these things go.
Yeah, you mentioned a column that you wrote for the New York Times recently, and it struck me, I have it in front of me, you wrote, I think studying how voters feel is also important, maybe even more important than studying what they think, which is a lot of what we do here on the GD Politics podcast. You also go on to say that the Trump administration's policies have created a large group of personally affected voters, and that may include government workers, people who touch the issue of immigration. It may include just people who have 401ks. I'm curious if any administration that does significant policy moves in accordance with what they campaigned on, are they going to spark this kind of backlash, or is this a unique moment, right? Like, Biden campaigned on big government spending. He got into office. He did big government spending. There was a pretty big backlash to the inflation that ensued. Obama comes in, passes the ACA. He said he wanted to do something like that, but still people feel like he's going too far. There's a backlash to that. I don't know what the sort of comparison point is to maybe Bush or Clinton, but is this just how politics works now, or is Trump doing something unique?
I think what is unique about this is that, let's take the Biden policies that people said they were, this is causing my cost of living to go up. It's usually it's like a few degrees of separation, right? And there was, I think, justifiable anger that it felt like the control room was empty. It felt like things were getting more expensive and the government was not focused on it or did not care about it. Here it is, my business had to close. I lost my job. And in the same way that you saw some backlash around those very personal effects during COVID that I think are part of what powered sending Donald Trump back to office, you're going to see that at scale here with people saying, my business had to close because the thing we need to import to make our product was getting tariffed at a bajillion percent. And
right, like the pieces for the computer are getting tariffed at 145%, but the computer is getting tariffed at only 10 or 20%, which helps American manufacturing how? But anyway, go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's the concentrated costs to diffuse benefits. And, this is assuming that the benefits that are promised by Trump come to fruition. They are going to be supposedly these economy-wide things, the revitalization of manufacturing, et cetera, but the costs are more immediate and more concentrated on the person who says, this is how much this thing cost last month. This is now how much this thing cost this month. And that's where the real issue emerges. I mean, Republicans run into this problem a lot when it comes to things like spending cuts in general, that in spending cuts, the benefits are diffuse. We will have less national debt. Less taxpayer money will be wasted, but it is more spread out across the tax-paying electorate where
and it's
the
our
costs,
future selves in some ways as well.
And our future selves where the costs are immediate and right now, and wait, don't you dare touch program X, Y, or Z because I benefit from it. So this isn't something new. Republicans, I think, have dealt with the tough politics of the concentrated costs diffuse benefits problem for a while. It's just being amplified in this tariffs moment, and in a way that I think is unusual for Republicans, because Republicans are not usually the party calling for tariffs.
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, it's giving 2010 a little bit, right? I mean, the pitch for Obamacare was that there would be broad-based benefits, but famously, people did lose their...
If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor.
yeah, they did.
Which you could not, apparently.
Which you could not. Right. People faced, as you said, very obvious, immediate, concentrated costs. I think you could, I guess... Actually, we are back to debating policy in some way in American politics, which is kind of fun again, right? I've heard more economic discussion, policy debate in the past 2-3 weeks than I think I heard for the prior, decade almost. So, I don't know. At least the nerd in me is having fun. But are Republicans finding themselves on the flip side of 2010 here? I think people are rushing to the Tea Party to draw comparisons.
I do think that the comparison is pretty apt, in part because who was the leader? The Republican Party spent 2009 fairly leaderless in the way that I think Democrats feel a little leaderless right now. And it was instead sort of the anger and frustration of just average rank and file of folks that began to bubble up, and you saw people getting mad at town halls, and you saw people showing up to rallies and protests. And eventually, by the time you got to that next midterm, it had been more honed and made into something more official. But right now, I mean, I am seeing this, my editors cut the phrase emotional asymmetry, but that's what I would really call this. The emotional asymmetry is in full gear right now, and this time it's not benefiting Republicans. In that column that you mentioned, I cited 2010 because that was the year where you had such frustration about what Obama and the Obama administration and the Democrats were doing that you had a Republican win a Senate seat in Massachusetts. And yes, Scott Brown was running against a bad candidate, you could argue, in Martha Coakley. But when you have these moments where there is this emotional asymmetry, you don't want to be the party whose supporters are kind of resting on their laurels while the other side is fired up and ticked. And in 2010, that's really what happened, that you did not have voters turning out to say, Dear Obama, thank you for the stimulus package and the Affordable Care Act. Instead, you had a lot of people that felt they personally were worse off as a result of these things, turning out to say, you gotta be kidding me. But you have had a backlash to Trump as well. In the 2018 resistance movement to Trump, you had Republicans lose a Senate seat in Alabama. Again, a bad candidate in Roy Moore, but when you have Republicans winning Senate seats in Massachusetts or losing Senate seats in Alabama, I mean, these are things that are possible when one party has really fired up, really ticked off voters, and the other side has voters that are like, oh, yeah, I think things are pretty good. And that is what I'm seeing in my data about Republicans and Democrats today. When I wrote that column in March, I believe 38% of Democrats had told me that they felt furious. Now, in the data that's in this piping hot fresh poll, it's up to 42% of Democrats say they feel furious about what Trump is doing, where for Republicans, it's only 25% who say they feel thrilled with how Trump is doing. So the intensity of emotion is just much more there on the opposition side than it is on the side saying they like what Trump is doing.
Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. We're talking about, I like that term, emotional asymmetry here, which if you sort of convert that to common parlance, it's maybe the turnout versus persuasion question. So we're talking about the kind of environment where you could see really amped up turnout amongst Democrats and Republicans who are like, I don't even know the people who are running in this random race, probably won't turn out in special elections. But then there's also persuasion. And in this tariff turmoil moment, it seems like we've seen some high-profile people start to question their support of Trump. I mean, I don't want to get too carried away here because I don't actually know how many Americans are represented by somebody like Dave Portnoy. But, somebody who supported Trump, who was recently, I think, on CNN saying, oh, I would vote for Democrats in the upcoming election. I never supported Republicans that hard. I was never all out MAGA. And you do see, people changing their minds in the data, right? I don't know if in some ways, this is good data to look at because it takes the politics a little bit out of it. So if you look at the Michigan consumer sentiment data, you see, I'm just going to cite some numbers here, so bear with me, that consumer sentiment fell for the fourth straight month and has now lost more than 30% since December 2024. It is at its lowest since June 2022, which is when annualized inflation levels hit 9%. And the index measuring expectations fell to the lowest since May 1980. So that means that Americans have pretty quickly soured on how they think the economy is doing and how they expect the economy to do going forward. And I don't think you can get these kinds of numbers unless a lot of Americans are feeling this way, not just your boomer resistance libs who made the most noise during sort of Trump's first term. Are you seeing persuasion taking hold, people turning on Trump? Or are you really just seeing this emotional asymmetry so far?
I think it's right now mostly emotional asymmetry, but a few warning signs for Trump here. So one, when we ask people, who'd you vote for in 2024? Of the people who in our survey tell us they voted for Donald Trump, 9% of them now say they disapprove of how he's handling his job as president. Now, that is soft. Most of it is the somewhat category. But you want to talk about asymmetry. Of people who voted for Trump, 58% strongly approve of what he's doing. Of those who voted for Harris, 83% strongly disapprove. So the asymmetry is massive, but it's also notable that you have about 1 in 10 people who voted for Trump who seem to be having a little bit of buyer's remorse. When we ask, do you approve or disapprove of how Donald Trump is handling the economy? Only 53% of Trump voters strongly approve. You have a lot in this mushy, somewhat approved type category, and then you have 13% of Trump voters who say they disapprove of how he's handling that issue. Now, you contrast that with something like immigration, where on immigration, Trump voters are still all in for him, and they are in for him strongly. 3 out of 4 Trump voters strongly approve of how Donald Trump is handling immigration. So it's not to say that, our Trump voter sample is mushy. I mean, these are people that on some issues where he's doing very controversial things, they're still with him, but on the economy seem to be expressing some beginnings of some reservations. And so I think do I think that these folks, by the time you get to next November, are going to turn out en masse for Democratic candidates down the ballot? Not necessarily. But do I think there are some folks who maybe turn out to vote when Donald Trump is on a ballot, but when he's not, are already borderline? And if they're not even that thrilled with what he's doing, may just stay home? That, to me, is the biggest threat to the Republican coalition right now. In a world where Trump has remade the coalition to be so heavily dependent upon more low propensity voters, people who, bless them, their lives are not obsessed with following the news day in and day out. They just want their lives to be a little better. And if they think Trump hasn't delivered, do I think they'll turn out to actively vote for a Democrat? Maybe not. But do I think that they'll stay home? Very potentially.
Yeah. And I mean, just one more piece of information on the people maybe changing their minds. Like, if you asked straight up last year, do you think America should levy tariffs? A majority of Americans said yes. But now, straight up, 3/4 of Americans said in a recent CBS News YouGov poll that they expect Trump's tariffs to increase prices in the short term. We've already talked about this, how famously, it's hard to convince Americans in the political realm that even if this does work, even if this is a great policy, that it's worth waiting out higher prices in the short term and not getting upset about them in order to maybe be more prosperous in the long term. But even when it comes to that, there's been some really interesting polling done on whether Americans want more manufacturing, and if there is more manufacturing, would want to actually work in the factories that created. So according to a Cato Institute poll, 80% plus of both Democrats and Republicans said America would be better off if more people worked in factories. But only around 25% of both Democrats and Republicans said they would be better off if they worked in a factory. And this is understanding that about 8% of Americans work in manufacturing, which is not to say that 8% of Americans work in a factory, because obviously the manufacturing sector can include white-collar jobs where people aren't actually on the floor of a factory. But it creates this dynamic where people are pretty much in agreement that short-term these tariffs won't be good for them. They think that long-term manufacturing would be good for America, but they themselves don't really want to work in those factories. Are we having a cultural debate here, or are we having an economic debate here?
It's a good question. I mean, I've seen a lot of people posting that result as a way, that poll that you mentioned, as a way to kind of dunk on anyone who is pro-tariffs, right? Look, you want to fantasize about everybody screwing tiny little screws in to assemble an iPhone, but look, no Americans really want to do it. In a way, you can read 1 in 4 Americans saying they think they would be better off working in a factory as like a really high number. That's actually a pretty surprisingly high number of Americans who think they would be better off if they had that kind of an opportunity. I think the question right now, and why this is, I still think it's mostly an economic debate, is because all of my data suggests that people don't actually want these tariffs implemented for the long haul, for real. This is our new economy. We don't trade as much with the rest of the world. That when we have asked voters in our polls, what do you think is the actual point of these tariffs? That by a 20-point margin, they more believe that this is about a negotiating tool to gain concessions from other countries. Only about a third of our respondents think this is being pursued primarily because Donald Trump really thinks it's good economic policy. Like, maintaining tariffs in and of themselves is a good thing. And so that to me is I think that people would like to see more manufacturing come back to the US. I think when they see things like, wait a minute, we don't make any PPE here anymore, they do get concerned about that. what do we make here? I think you're right that there's a cultural element of nostalgia for a time when we made things with our hands. That, I think you're not wrong to say, I don't know how many Gen Zers want to get a job putting the little screws in a factory. At the same time, I think for many Americans, they're not viewing these tariffs as a means to some kind of greater American manufacturing. They're thinking this is a way for us to, maybe we use it to get other countries to lower their tariffs. Maybe we use it as a way to get countries to do other things we want them to do. And that to me is a problem of the White House's messaging around this, is like, depending on which cabinet secretary you have on TV, you get a different rationale for why we're doing this tariff strategy in the first place.
Well, Kristen, it's like that meme, which, I'm just sort of revealing myself to be way too online here, even referencing memes during our conversation. But it's like, okay, Trump signs new tariffs into law, and then there's like a person in a MAGA hat saying, it's going to create jobs. And then it's like, tariffs have been undone, art of the deal. And then it's back to, we're putting tariffs in action. It's going to create more jobs. And then it's, okay, tariffs have been taken away. It's art of the deal. So is this a negotiating tactic, or is this a play to bring manufacturing back to America? And it seems like the White House itself doesn't know, or like kind of wants it to be both, but also can't, in an intellectually consistent world, be both.
Yeah, I feel like there are some people who are trying to square the circle here and say this is all part of some big master plan, and it's all being done, both to... I think there are fair arguments to be made that there are countries that put really high tariffs on our rice or our cars or our dairy. And if you want to do that, then you have to be prepared for us to do the same back to you. And that's fair as fair. And if the end goal is to get those countries to lower the tariffs that they've placed on American automobiles or American dairy or American products, then I think that's probably a good thing. And that's where you get the free traders in the Republican Party going like, please, maybe that's what we're really trying to go for here. But if the end goal is actually just to make it so that everything has to be made in the U.S. from start to finish, from the beginning pieces of the product all the way to the end, we need to disentangle the global supply chain. I think that you're going to find that actually following through on that policy is going to create a lot more short-term pain than the American electorate is willing to tolerate.
And to that point, to mention just one more poll here, and then I'm going to move on from tariffs specifically, but the Washington Post polled 500 manufacturing workers about Trump's tariffs, which I think is super interesting. And they found the response to be largely negative. 57% said tariffs would hurt their jobs. 59% said tariffs would hurt their companies. The majority were opposed to tariffs. And they generally said that they understand that parts from all over the world are used in the things that they create. And so even when you take it out of the realm of nostalgia and you actually ask people who are working in manufacturing, they don't like it. I thought that was pretty striking.
Yeah, I think the notion that tariffs are a big political winner is just not correct. And I think voters had given Trump a large amount of leeway on the issue because he was viewed as being pretty good on the economy. But when you have things like the bond market panicking, that really undercuts that. And I think if you think about within Trump, there are two wolves. There is the one wolf that since the time I have been alive on this planet, he has thought that global trade is bad and we need higher tariffs. On the other hand, Donald Trump really wants to be viewed by CEOs, by successful individuals, by his voters, by the electorate in general, as this economic genius. His pursuit of this tariff policy, especially in the way he was doing it, was running directly counter to that second goal. And so I think that the only way you can have both of these things happening at once, I want to pursue tariffs, but I also want to be viewed as an economic genius, is if the tariffs are ultimately a negotiating tool that you're using to lead to lower overall tariffs in the end, or some other kind of end goal. I think the idea that you're going to levy all these tariffs make everything really expensive to come into the United States, and think that Americans are going to go, sure, I'm totally fine with everything I buy getting more expensive in exchange for possibly getting a job in a factory. I just think that is a very politically risky gamble for Republicans to be following through on.
Okay, well, we will see where things go from here. By the end of the day, the markets could have made a liar out of me, and the S&P 500 will no longer be down 12% since its peak. I think it was rising in the morning the last time I checked. We'll see where things land. But I want to move on to something else that was rising this morning, which was a Blue Origin space flight with Katy Perry, Gayle King, Lauren Sanchez, and some others on board. It was an all-female flight into space, near space. There's some debate over how spacey the space was that they went to. And so this prompted my idea to play a little game of guess what Americans think about space. Are you ready, Kristen?
I'm ready.
You're not playing against anyone, so you automatically win, just to put that out there.
Oh, thank you for taking the pressure off.
But I think it will be fun nonetheless. Okay, so here we go. What percentage of Americans told YouGov that they would be interested in living in a colony on Mars for the remainder of their lives?
12%.
12%. Okay, it was 25%
Whoa!
of Americans, which is giving me flashbacks to like when it was like 12% of like Hispanic males said that they had a license to operate a nuclear submarine in that like Pew Research experiment.
Oh, we use that as a trap question. We use that as a trap question all the time on our surveys.
Okay, so I'm not sure that a quarter of Americans actually feel that way, but the thing that stuck out to me the most was that 45% of 18 to 34-year-olds said they would like to spend the remainder of their lives in a colony on Mars, which is like, is that just intense nihilism set in amongst the youngest Americans? Is that like troll behavior and they're actually winning here? Because it seems like people 55 and up took... I mean, I guess they're related, right? Because 55 and up, they were like, hell no. Like, I'm not going to Mars. I don't want to stay there. Would not, could not, will not. Although, arguably, those people would have to spend far less time on Mars, given that they're significantly older.
That's dark.
Anyway. Okay, next question. What percentage of Americans believe that the U.S. government has kept the existence of UFOs from the public?
55%.
Okay, you got it right that there's a majority. It was, Kristen, 79% of Americans believe that the U.S. government has kept the existence of UFOs from the public.
Incredible.
This is a slightly different question from, do you believe that some UFOs have been alien people or spacecraft or whatever, which is my next question. What percentage of Americans believe that some UFOs have been alien spacecraft?
Ooh, I bet that's 85%. And I'm using the number you just gave me as a minimum floor, because how could you believe the government is withholding information about UFOs and not believe that UFOs exist?
Okay, I'm going to help you out here, which is like, I think they could say some of it is military planes. And the U.S. is just not sharing information about their experimental aircraft.
Okay.
Because it's lower. It's lower than.
Okay. Well, then in that case, I'll say 60%.
Okay. It's 41%, which also tells me that like Americans just really don't trust the government. I think in some ways people are saying, well, I don't trust the government to be transparent about UFOs. But if you're asking me if I actually believe that UFOs have been alien spacecraft, 41% say yes. But in a 2-year span, that rose 8 percentage points. And that was during all of those congressional hearings about the UFOs. Okay. This one's, I guess, right on topic for today. What percentage of Americans expect routine space tourism over the next 50 years? This is a poll from 2023. So I guess it's already
2023. 45%.
Very close. It's 55% of Americans expect routine space tourism over the next 50 years. So now my question for you, Blue Origin is putting together another flight into space. You get to ride with Lauren Sanchez, Katy Perry, Gayle King. Are you going?
Absolutely not. Godspeed to them. Wish them well. I will not go too deep into my quibbles about whether or not this constitutes being an astronaut. But I can't criticize it too much because you don't see me putting on that suit. You don't see me blasting off. So you know what? I can't criticize it because I don't have the guts to do it myself.
Yeah, Kristen, I got over my fear of flying only a handful of years ago. So I'm not going to space. I would pay good money to not have to go to space if somebody offered me going to space.
Now, do you watch Severance?
No, I don't.
Okay, so imagine that there was a technology that would allow you to turn your brain effectively off. You could do it, come back, and you would have it'd be like anesthesia. You'd have no memory that you did it. Then, if somebody was offering you $1 million to do it, would you do it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, come on. 538 just got shut down. I'd take the $1 million.
I've introduced a lot of things. I've introduced brain implants as well as the $1 billion incentive. So there's a lot going on. That is not just that's like a triple-barreled survey question. It's methodologically disastrous, but
I think we're going to leave it there today. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Galen.
My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you would be so kind to rate and review, maybe even tell a friend about the podcast. Also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.